Testing. I want to welcome everybody here. It's just about a little after 6, 1 after, so why don't we get started. My name is Joel Booger. I'm the chair of the board, the select board. Peter Coffey and Ken Lattis are also here from the board. Welcome everybody here for the EmeraldAB board public hearing. And Valerie will take it over from here, our town administrator, to introduce our panelists. Here you've got a presentation, and then we will take questions. They will take questions afterwards. Okay? And there is brochures in the back of the table. I think somebody got some.
And also feel free to help yourself to refreshments, and the restroom is in the back to the net corner. So I'm Valerie Caples. I'm the town administrator. And we first received official notification that the emerald ash borer was found in Bristol on June 5th. And since that day, Elise Shadler from the Vermont Urban and Community Forestry Program, John Swepston, our town forester, or town tree warden, excuse me, Chris Olson, the Addison County forester, and Judy Rosofsky, the Vermont state entomologist, have been at our side and stepping up to help in whatever way they can to help the community and us as individuals and property owners deal with the situation. So with that, I'd like to turn it over to Elise, and she can introduce the rest of the folks.
Thanks. Hi, everybody. Great to see lots of very familiar faces in the audience. My name is Elise Shadler, for those of you who I don't yet know, and I'm the program manager for the state's Urban and Community Forestry Program. So our program is a collaborative of UVM Extension and the Department of Forest, Parks, and Recreation. And we're here tonight to talk about emerald ash borer. And I don't know why it's not, Keith's gonna work on that. Just showing the presentation itself. Okay, so who's here? Myself, representing Urban and Community Forestry. Judy Rosofsky, who is our state entomologist with the Vermont Department of Agriculture, Food, and Markets. Keith Thompson, who is our
AV coordinator.
AV coordinator. County forester. What is your?
Private lands program
Private
manager.
lands program manager. So he works with all the county foresters throughout the state, and then Chris Olson, who is your Addison County forester. So before we get started, a couple of quiz questions for the audience. So who's from Bristol? And then everybody else. So we've got Middlebury folks, we've got some Ferrisburg folks, we've got some Charlotte folks. Any other towns? Ripton, Lincoln, Second? Huntington? Panton. And Starsboro. Okay, excellent. And then as far as your interest in being here, forest landowners. Okay. Homeowner interest, just you have any big trees in the property. Municipality representatives, so great. And then I know we got a couple tree wardens in the room. Okay, fantastic.
Tree lovers?
Tree lovers. There we go. Okay. And weird. Sorry. Having some baby issues, which might be okay. It's really low. Let's see if this works. Sure. Okay, let's roll it. There we go. Up. There we go. Okay. There we are. All of us. And Valerie, who's over there, who's been extremely helpful in setting this meeting up. We weren't going to hold a public meeting in Bristol. After the initial infestation detections in the central Vermont region, in Grand Isle, and down in Bennington, we convened large groups of state reps, and then we brought folks up from APHIS as well, or from the Forest Service, and we had very little attendance. So the standard from now on will not necessarily be for us to come in and do these presentations, but I was getting a lot of emails right off the bat from folks in Bristol. Hi, David. So we thought that this would be appropriate, and looking around the room, I sense that there's a pretty deep base knowledge of EAB in this room. So has anybody not heard of EAB yet? Okay, great. So So a lot of this I think we're going to be able to zip through. We are going to probably present a lot of information that you may not retain all of it. And the first thing I actually would love to do is just point out these two websites. VTinvasives.org. If you have never been to that site, it is the one-stop shop for information about not only invasive forest pests, but also aquatics and terrestrial plants. So that is where all of the partners involved at the state level really collaborate to make sure that that website is kept up to date, and all of our information about EAB is on that site. So the two features that I really highlight on that website are there's an EAB listserv, so that we manage. It's a listserv that if you sign up for the listserv, you only ever going to get an email when there are pertinent EAB updates that need to be communicated to stakeholders throughout the state. So when there's a new infestation, that you would get an email for that. We anticipate that as new infestations pop up, the press is not always going to pick up on every single one. Right now it's still new in the state, but we anticipate that that's not always going to be the case. So this is one way that you can guarantee that you will get an email and get a notification when a new infestation is confirmed. The other thing about that, the VT Invasive site, is that's where we are really, really asking for people that think they have EAB or think they have an EAB infested tree to report it. So there's a button right on the front page that says report it. You press that. Goes through a process of asking you whether you're sure it's EAB, gives you some lookalikes that it might be instead, and asks you to submit a couple of photos of what you're seeing. That way it goes to all of the partners and somebody can triage it and get out there and check out the tree. We're getting a lot of individual emails to separate people right now with like a blurry photo attached in the email, and it's really hard for us to be able to field all those requests. To be honest, we're really asking people, and for those of you who work with volunteers and citizens, just make sure they know that that's where we're really asking people to go. And then the VT Community Forestry page is my program's website. We have specific information that's more specific to municipal planning. So for those of you representing towns, this is where you find like a planning worksheet and some information about pricing, budgeting, inventory information, etc. So those are the two sites that I just want to make sure you know about before, and they'll be at the end of the slideshow as well. What we're going to do is I'm going to give you a little story about EAB in Vermont and go over ash tree ID, which might be a primer for some of you. You might be very aware of what ash looks like, but maybe not. Judy's going to talk about EAB life cycle, impact on ash, and signs and symptoms to look for. Keith and Chris are going to talk about Vermont's approach, the slow the spread recommendations that the state has put out, and then management options for forest landowners. So I anticipate that is of interest to many people here. And then I'm going to talk more about homeowners and municipalities, insecticide treatment, and then I'll give some case studies of what's happening in towns in Vermont right now. And then we have questions at the bottom, but I think this is a small enough group that if you have them as they arise, just feel free to ask. This is the story of EAB in Vermont. This is not an EAB, this is a costume that one of our volunteers in Johnson made for us that is very fun. This is actually an EAB, and I'm going to send around samples of the pest during Judy's talk. But this is the beetle. It's very small. It is now in 35 states in the US and 5 Canadian provinces. So from 2002 until today, this is the spread of EAB. So this is the most recent. Every red dot represents a county that EAB has been confirmed to be in. And the initial infestation was in Detroit in 2002, but we anticipate that it was there probably since the mid-1990s. Very little was known about this pest before its landfall in North America, because in its native habitat, which is in Asia, Korea, Japan, China, and Russia, it lives in harmony and balance. It is co-adapted with the ash species there, as well as native associated insect predators so that it is kept in check. And so it's never really been an issue there. When it came here, obviously our native ash species are not adapted to deal with this, and it has no predators. So it has largely moved unchecked for the last almost 2 decades. EAB will naturally fly 1 to 2 miles a year to find food. But that means that if it was naturally moving from Detroit to New England, it would have taken about 400 years, and it took less than a decade to make it to New England. So we know that something else is going on here, and this is another little, this is every year since 2002, the new infestations that have been confirmed. So it's obviously what's happening is more than 1 to 2 miles per year. So that now we are, in a place where some had more active years, some less active years. But here we are at 2019. So it's obvious that we are helping facilitate the spread of emerald ash borer, and once you learn a little bit more about the biology and how EAB is actually infesting the trees, you may understand a little bit better how easy it is to transport this pest undetected, because it really is living, the larvae is living right underneath the bark of the tree. And ash makes great firewood. Ash is used for a variety of wood products that it's traveling, and you really can't tell that it's there overwintering by just looking at a piece of ashwood. So this is a story that I often tell. A colleague of ours is in Salem, Massachusetts. This photo was taken before EAB was in Massachusetts, or before it was confirmed in Massachusetts. And this is at a wood-fired pizza place right in downtown Salem, and it's the early morning, and he was just kind of kicking around. And walked up and was like, oh, I'll just kind of see what I find. And lo and behold, he sees this, which is a very characteristic Serpentine gallery. This wood was treated, this is heat treated, so this is not like the introduction of EV to Massachusetts. It just goes to show how easy it is for that to go undetected in a pile of firewood. So the spread, I'm going to just jump a little bit to how we're seeing it play out in all these different places. So one of the benefits of being in the 32nd or 33rd state to have found EAB is that we have the vast experiences of all the other states and all of our other partners and all the other areas that we can learn from. So there's been a lot of research since 2002 that's been done on EAB. And how it really has been seen to play out once it's in an area. So let's use Bristol for an example. We know it's here. We know the tree that was infested is right down South Street, and it's no longer there. What?
North Street.
North Street. Sorry.
South Street.
North Street. We're on South Street. It's on North Street. Thank you. So that tree was probably been infested for 4 or 5 years, based on the fact that it was dead. So the way that the pest has really played out in other areas is that around year 8 or 9, you'll see a boom in the population density of the EAB itself. And following right behind that, around year 10, you'll see the mortality of ash increase. So whereas you see eventually you're at near 100% mortality of ash in an area, once that food source is gone, the population of EAB will go back down. It will persist on the landscape. I think there was a hope at the beginning, back in the day, that it would run out of food and it would eventually leave an area. But we're seeing that EAB will infest an ash stem 1 inch in diameter. So if you know anything about ash and how vigorous of a stump sprouter it is, we really don't see the potential for this to totally leave Vermont. It'll be on the landscape in North America. Yeah.
What's the risk that it adapts and decides to go after other trees after it's been consumed all the ash?
That is a good question.
Could you repeat the question?
The question was, what is the risk that the pest will adapt and start to feed on other species? I don't know. I've never got that question before.
I have, but the answer is we don't know. There is one other tree it seems to attack, the white fringe tree,
Chinanthus.
something species, which is sold through the nursery trade, so it is a minimal risk, but that's about all we know. I mean, we're certainly looking to make sure it isn't changing host species, but that might just have to unfold over time.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the distribution of ash across the landscape, it's a very widespread genus. So I think for the time being, it's not running out of. I think under that pressure, then we'll see. But for now, yeah.
I think your mic isn't working.
The mic's not working.
No, it is.
I'm just not putting it right because I, like most people, hate this. So I will do better. It's also worth mentioning that there has been a lot of research that's been done on tolerance and resistance to EAB in our native ash species. So our species in Vermont are white, green, and black. There are, I believe, 16 North American species across the country, but those are the 3 that we have in Vermont. There's been research in the Midwest about this, the idea of tolerance or resistance. So tolerance means you have a tree that will eventually succumb to EAB, but maybe it hangs on for 5 years longer, or maybe it hangs on for 7 years longer. It has some level of tolerance to the pest. Whereas resistance is extremely rare, resistance being completely unaffected by EAB. There was a study and a webinar that were released earlier, or I guess last year, where they were looking at plots, and they saw between 0.1 and 1% of tolerant trees across plots. And there are already crossbreeding programs in play in the Midwest, so much like with the American elm and the American chestnut, which unfortunately this is all playing out again. We've learned a lot from those experiences, so we're back crossing these tolerant or resistant ash with Asian varieties. So that, just like now we have all these elm hybrids that are being planted out again on the street, the hope is that one day we will have those species to plant again. So the state has been in the EAB game for a really long time. We've been doing monitoring and detection since 2008. In this room is Ms. Caitlin Cusack, who was our forest pest outreach coordinator for a number of years. So a lot of this stuff is happening under her watch, but if you've seen the purple or the green traps set up around the state, that was monitored by our state partners. We do a lot of outreach. We do trap tree peeling. We do Cerceris wasp monitoring. These are ground-dwelling wasps that live in baseball fields and feed on pests like EAB. So we have been really trying to find EAB for quite a long time. And we had all these speculations about where it might pop up. What would be the natural place for it to pop up in Vermont when it first came. And nobody really thought it would be in Orange, in the middle of Orange, Vermont. On a private landowner's property, a consulting forester found that first infestation. So this is where we are as of July. After the Bristol detection in June, there was another detection in Derby Line, right on the Canadian border, actually at the Haskell Library, which sits on the border, right on the border. Half of it's Canadian, half of it's US. And so the way that this map works is that the red, at the very center of that red circle, is a confirmed infested tree or a confirmed infested trap. So the Stanford Southern infestation, we actually haven't found a tree yet. We have found 2 pests on purple traps. So at the center of that red circle is that epicenter. The circle represents a 5-mile radius around that tree or that trap. And then the yellow represents 5 miles beyond that. So we're calling that total area the infested area. If you're in the red, it's likely that you have EAB in your town. If you're in the entire infested area and you have trees that you would like to treat, maintain through insecticide use, which I'll talk about later, we recommend you start doing that if you're in that circle. We are in 7 counties now, so half of the state's counties have an infestation. Ash trees. So 5 to 7% is estimated across the state in our native forests, but there are some areas where you probably know it's a lot higher than that. The island, Grand Isle County is one place we know that it's likely much higher than 5 to 7%. Our program has done a lot of public tree inventory work, so downtown trees. So we actually did one in Bristol back in 2014. And so I was able to come and meet with Valerie and John, give them a map, have the exact location of the 34 public ash trees in Bristol. So we've done a lot of that, and you can see the variety. You know, it's 6% of the street tree population here. Middlebury, just down the road, they've got 85, about 9%. Burlington's also about 9%. There are towns in the Midwest and Colorado that are 50, 60, 75% green ash on their streets. So it's a different story in every state, but by and large, I don't really see it being more than 10% of any community's trees. We're doing a lot of rural right-of-way inventory, and I'll show you some information about that, and some of you are going to be at a training with me afterwards. But along the rural right-of-way, you know, Randolph estimates they have 6,000, the cuts off here, but East Montpelier just finished their rural ash right-of-way inventory, and they're at 1,815. So on our rural right-of-way, we're going to see a lot more than those 15 in downtown Barrie. Do a really quick ash tree ID overview. Who's really good with ash ID? Awesome. So one thing that we are recommending, or for folks who are action-oriented and want to do something to help in their communities, holding an ash tree ID workshop for citizens is a really, really good idea. EAB is only going to impact your ash trees, but we know already that in Charlotte there was a woman who paid a lot of money to hire an arborist to treat 3 box elder trees for EAB. So the first step in public education is helping people know what an ash is and how many they have on their property that they need to be thinking about. So if you're looking for something to do, that's a really great service you can do to your community if you know ash. I'm running low on time, so I'm going to zip through some of these. It's obviously a deciduous tree. It looks a lot different when it's planted in a community than it does on the side of the road. I was in Plainfield yesterday doing roadside ash inventory, and I've seen a lot of this. So a lot of ash regeneration, small stems right underneath the utility lines. This is my favorite ash tree in Vermont on Route 116 in Heinsberg. It's being treated tomorrow. So the foliage in the fall for white generally starts at a very pretty maroon. The green ash, bright yellow. The form of the tree, when I talk about ID of ash, I think it's the easiest way for me to describe it to volunteers is by looking at the branching structure. So ash is one of a few species of trees in Vermont that you see that have opposite branching. So you see right here, the buds come off the branch directly across from each other, opposed to alternate branching, which would be a bud here, then a bud across the stem here, here, here. So an elm is a great example of something that's alternate versus ash and maple are both opposite. The other thing about ash that I think is really helpful to think about is that I like to say it has stubby fingers. So whereas something else like a maple or an elm, as you go further away from the main stem, the branches tend to taper and get thin and wispy at the ends, the tips. Ash doesn't really do that. It kind of stays thick all the way to the branch tip. So, so you have these thick, kind of candelabra type branches coming off of the stem. We say that the bark has this nice diamond-shaped, very deep groove, very uniform pattern. I find this sometimes a little hard for people, particularly because when they're young, they don't look like this at all. So actually yesterday I took some photos of different, from young stems to a little older. This is where, I guess around maybe, is that like 6 to 8 inch diameter, you're starting to see those grooves, and then some mature, really, really distinct grooves in larger trees. They have compound leaves, so each leaf is a collection of leaflets. White is generally 7 leaflets, but green You'll see anywhere from 5 to 9 leaflets on a leaf. But that compound leaf is another great way to look for ash right now, this time of year. Some people think it's a lot easier to ID ash in the wintertime. I agree because of that branching pattern, but for folks who really rely on leaves, which I think a lot of beginners do really need to look at the leaf, this is a great time to learn. They do have flowers, they are inconspicuous. They're primarily wind pollinated. And then just to go over a couple of species you might confuse with ash, or one might confuse with ash. On this side of these slides is the ash, over here is the species that might be confused. Box elders I think is a big one. The bark, not so much, but it is also an opposite branching. It's a maple genus, so it is opposite branching, and it also has a compound leaf. So that's one that I spent a lot of time working with people to see the difference. And when you look at the leaflets on the compound leaf, you'll notice that they they're serrated to an extent. They're not smooth and entire like the ash. We get questions about mountain ash, just because of the name. I don't think it looks anything like an ash, but just so everyone knows, it's not in the Fraxinus genus, it's a sorbus, so it will not be impacted by EAB. Walnut, I think because of the bark and also because of the compound leaf, but you notice that there are significantly more leaflets on the walnut than on ash. And then hickory, I think not shagbark, probably wouldn't mistake that for an ash, but on some of our other leaflets, you might, because of that, again, that compound leaf. Yesterday when I was in Plainfield, I was also looking for other things that I was kind of like catching my eye as I was walking down the road. And some of the quaking aspen, the big ones, the base of the bark, before you look up and see that it's a poplar, I was at an ash. So that's another one that you mixed up on. So I'm going to pass it on to Judy.
Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me okay?
Yep.
All right. So let's test your foreign language skills. Anyone know the Latin name for the EAB? No one's willing to try and embarrass himself. Okay, so it's a Grylus planopennis, and so the genus is a Grylus and the species is a Grylus planopennis. For scientific reasons, you always put the genus and species name together for the species to confuse the innocent. And we do have some other native Agrylus species, and they actually look quite a bit alike, and they also can make those D-shaped holes that look like that momentarily. So that can be confusing, just so you know right ahead of time. So to give you some idea of what you might be up against when you're looking at different possible EABs. I wonder if this has a little pointer on it. Whee! There you go. So this is an actual emerald ash borer. These are two native borers, the chestnut line and the bronze birch borer. Surprisingly, one of the most common insects mistaken for the emerald ash borer is this one, which is a six-spotted tiger beetle. So if you see a beetle that you think is emerald ash borer, but it has 6 spots on it, it's not emerald ash borer. And another way to tell it apart is if it's crawling on the ground. Emerald ash borers don't crawl on the ground. They're either going to fly or be on the leaves, but you will rarely see them crawling around. On the other hand, if you think you have EAB and you're not sure, we'd much rather have false alarms than miss an infestation. So don't be shy. Get in touch with us if you actually think you have it. I'm going to talk a little about the life cycle of the emerald ash borer. And I should point out at the beginning that these insects, their development is highly dependent on a couple of things. Temperature, the age to which they live, and how much resistance the tree is able to muster against them. So in newly infested trees, that tree is fighting pretty hard against the insect, and that can delay their development. So any of the numbers I give you are approximate, and they're going to be affected by temperature and the health of the tree that they're in. I guess I will stop turning my back to you if I look at the picture over here. So the adults will emerge around this time of year. So, and that's going to vary in different parts of the country, but in Vermont, it's from about June through August that adults emerge, but peak emergence is probably in July. They'll come out and they don't mate right away. They'll actually eat. Oh, sorry, you have a question?
Yeah. After the larvae become adults, do they disperse, or are you likely to find a colony of the adults still hanging around?
So the question was, do they, after they become adults, do they disperse, or are they in a colony? And I'll get to that in a minute. But basically, they tend to stay in the same tree, but some will disperse. So the adults emerge and feed on the trees for a couple of weeks, 1 to 3 weeks. They usually don't cause significant defoliation, but in intense infestations, I'm told that you will see leaf defoliation, but that's not the life stage that really damages the tree. And then they'll mate. The females live longer than the males, and the females will start laying eggs, and they don't lay their eggs all in one place. So they'll lay, 3 to 6 in one spot, and then move somewhere else and lay more. And I think the average is 55 per female, but that can range a great deal, and that actually depends on how long the female lives. So the longer she lives, the more eggs she can produce. And I think I saw the number 275. And for an insect, that's actually not one of the higher numbers, but they, are able to reproduce rapidly just because their survival is so good because they have so few natural enemies here. So the eggs will, and I'm going to show you pictures of all these life stages. They lay the eggs, and the eggs take somewhere between 7 and 14 days, again, depending on temperature. And little hatched larvae, the eggs are on the surface of the tree. They're not in the tree, so the larvae have to chew their way in. And then they're going to undergo 4 molts. And then they'll form what's called a J larvae as they prepare to overwinter. So we talk about what we call the flight season when the emerald ash borer are active is basically from June 1 to October 1. And after that, they're starting to overwinter. They're not going to be climbing out of the tree or laying eggs. They're done with that. So we do, and I'm sure you're going to talk about this, ask people not to move suspected infested wood during the flight season if at all possible, or to follow our recommendations if you are going to do that. So anyway, okay, so we had the adult, we had the eggs, we had the larvae, and then they overwinter as prepupa, and then in April and May, they pupate, and then become adults, and then chew their way out of the tree. But any given tree can have almost all of those life stages in it at one time. Just because of those differences in developmental timing. Okay. So let's just show you what I've been talking about. So that's the adult feeding on the tree. These are the eggs. And they're somewhat embedded into the bark, but not really. I've never seen them before, and I was like, how the heck are we ever going to see those? And then this would be, one of the first instars, second, third, and it's actually probably second, third, and fourth. But only a scientist would care. And this is what's called the J larva. You see it sort of folds itself into a third there. It's made a pupal tunnel. It folds itself up. It overwinters like that. And then in the spring, it's going to pupate and then become an adult and take off. So it took us a while to realize that what these things look like. And they have various intermediate stages, and they can be different colors. So at one point, I think it was a Montpelier infestation, one was brought to me, and I'm like, I don't know what this is. So we've all had a learning curve. I mentioned that the adults defoliate the tree, but that's not what causes the tree health problems. So that's Chris and myself right here in Bristol. And you might be able to see all these larval galleries. So the larvae chew in these characteristic serpentine galleries, and this tree was so densely infected, I don't think there was any unchewed piece of wood under the bark. And they put these tunnels in the phloem, which is a layer basically between the bark and the wood, where your tree has its transportation channels. Phloem transports sugars and nutrients up and down the tree. And this will basically girdle the tree. It will cut off the circulation. And this is just showing you a couple of larvae hanging out, and where in the bark of the tree they do that. And then this is, there's characteristic Serpentine Galleries, and I don't know if you can see, but they'll start out really small, and then as the larvae grows, the tunnels get wider, and then they emerge. So this is a sort of timeline of the impact that the insects have on the trees. And one message I want to send you home with is you don't know when you have emerald ash borer in your trees. You know, the trees can be asymptomatic. I've gone into the woods and seen a perfectly healthy tree that had absolutely no signs or symptoms, and we peeled the bark and there were tons of galleries. But there's nothing you can see that would say this tree is infested, except it happened to be in the middle of a dense infestation, and we suspected those trees were all going to have galleries in them. So this is just showing you over time. So you have a perfectly healthy tree that's, whoops, that was the wrong way to go. So that would be what your healthy tree looks like and what the crown looks like. And then here, the next one over is an early sign of the early infestation, and it looks identical to the perfectly healthy tree. The insects go to the top of the canopy, and they start feeding up there, so that's why you'll see dieback up in the canopy first. It's another thing that makes it hard to detect whether you have emerald ash borer. Everything that's going on is happening at the, up in the canopy level. And then over time, you'll see increasing dieback and decline in the canopy of the tree. All right, so now I'm just going to talk briefly about some of the signs and symptoms that will help you identify emerald ash borer, and you can go out onto the streets in Bristol right here and help us delineate the extent of the infestation by trying to see if you can find suspect trees. And then don't forget to take good photographs and turn it into a report on vtinvasives.org. So one of the first things I look for is woodpecker holes, or woodpecker pecks, as we call them. And I find that to be one of the more useful things. You can see it. It means there are insects in the tree. It doesn't necessarily mean it's emerald ash borer, but it's a really good sign to look for. If I see a wound in the tree, then that might be an entry port for what we call secondary pests, which are insects that can get in through those wounds and cause the tree to decline, but they won't necessarily kill it outright. That's why they're called secondary. So woodpeckers will go after those too. But it's a good starting point if you see woodpecker holes. Woodpeckers do have to learn how to find emerald ash borer, but once they find them, they can kill up to 80% and sometimes more of the insects that are in the tree. So woodpeckers are your friends. A similar symptom, but this can be more confusing for people who haven't had experience, is flecking. So we talk about pecking and flecking. It's also known as ash blonding, and that just confused the heck out of us, so we're trying to use flecking. It's the woodpecker feet fleck the bark off, and they leave it these sort of, I don't know what you call it, orangey or yellow kind of marks, usually in combination with the woodpeck hole in it. But that's, especially in an advanced infestation, that's highly visible and really easy to spot. This is one of the more definitive symptoms, is the S-shaped galleries. The problem is you have to cut into the tree to find them. So Serpentine Galleries, these are some good examples. Oops. Again, they start out small and get bigger. We need to get, we have the authority from the state to go and peel the tree or do what we need to, but we really like to get landowner permission before we peel a tree or cut one down to confirm that it is indeed an emerald ash borer infestation. Any infestation found in a new county, because this insect is still regulated by the USDA, we have to secure a specimen and send it to the USDA. So if you are in a county other than the ones where we've already found emerald ash borer, then the galleries aren't good enough. We would need to actually capture one. I can't wait for that situation to arise. Another helpful symptom is bark splitting. The creation of these tunnels under the bark will sometimes cause it to stress and crack. You'll get like a 6-inch crack. And that's how we found the infestation in Barry. Stephen LaValle, our sharp-eyed USDA colleague, just happened to see a crack in the tree, looked under it, saw the galleries, and that's how we found that out. Seeing the galleries, yeah, that's very handy. All right. Another good symptom is epicormic sprouting. That's suckers, some people call them, but it's usually lower on the tree bole. So if this were a tree, you'd be seeing the new little branches coming out from the bottom, sometimes a thick clump of them. That's also another pretty good telltale sign. So it's basically combinations of these signs and symptoms that lead us to take the step of peeling the bark off to confirm. D-shaped exit holes. These can be quite helpful, but there are often a lot of holes that look D-shaped that are not from emerald ash borer, that are either from natives or from similar insects that have similar looking holes but are more angled. But again, it's in a combination with the other symptoms. Now, of course, if you see the emerald ash borer head sticking out, that's a really good and then another symptom is canopy thinning. Anything going on in the canopy of an ash tree is worth taking a look at. And one thing about canopy symptoms is that you can see them from far away. So if you're driving around or you're looking out in your yard and you see yellowing leaves or dieback or something on an ash tree, and make sure it's an ash, remember, opposite, not alternate. One mnemonic for ash and the opposite leaf thing is mad horse, maple, ash, dogwood, horse chestnut. Those all have opposite branching. So yes, make sure it's an ash, and then if you see dieback on it, go and look for some of those other symptoms. And now I'm going to turn it over to Keith. All right, thank you very much.
Thank you, Judy. So I'm going to take a moment to talk about what Vermont's response has been and kind of how we got here. Folks at least mentioned how fast emerald ash borer spreads, and we were the 33rd state to find it here, and it's within that context that we chose to take the approach that we did. Had we been the first state, I'm sure we would have approached it very differently. But regardless, we've got a lot of folks on board who we're coordinating with to shape the approach that we're using. Vermont Agency of Agriculture, Food and Markets, Vermont Department of Forest, Parks and Recreation, U.S. Forest Service, USDA APIS, and UVM Extension are all really closely involved in making sure we reach out to the right stakeholders. Because I work on private lands, I'm not super engaged with the utilities or super engaged with the towns, but they're really important partners and really important folks that are affected in significant ways by this. So it's important to be coordinated and have a solid message on it. There is a federal quarantine. Vermont is entirely within the federal quarantine, and that was one of the first decisions that we had to wrestle with is, do we want to encompass all of Vermont in federal quarantine, or do we want to go on a county-by-county basis? We chose to go with a statewide quarantine, meaning that all of Vermont fell into the federal quarantine, and allowed us to really focus our efforts on communication and coordination in the ways that we have and the efforts that I'll share. Well, basically, it's to really apply our efforts to the local slow-to-spread efforts, as opposed to really drawing a hard line on county boundaries, recognizing that we're 5 years behind the ball in many respects. So our strategy has really been to focus on slow the spread, and that is as relevant today as it was when we first started, if not more relevant. Recognizing all the communities that have been impacted across the country, it wouldn't have moved at the pace that it had if people hadn't been moving it. Of course, not everybody's aware that they're moving it, but to the extent that they can be conscious of the risks, is another year, another couple of years, another 5 or 10 years for a community to get organized, to get its budgets together, to make a game plan for responding to emerald ash borer, or another opportunity for more research to get done to better understand how to control this pest or what its real implications are for the landscape. So slowing the spread is one of the most important things that everybody can do. And that goes for the landowner who's cutting trees in their backyard, understanding what are you going to do with that brush in a way that doesn't move the bug. For a landowner who is cutting firewood or cutting saw timber, where is that wood going when it leaves the property? For a utility who's managing their lines and managing the hazards, what's happening with that wood? So there are so many opportunities for EAB to be moved through the wood. There's just also a really great opportunity for communities to get organized and think about how we can be part of the solution, or at least not exacerbate the problem.
So yeah, quick question. In terms of who's notifying utilities for?
Yeah, they all know. We had a meeting last summer with representatives from every utility. Washington Electric is doing management now. Green Mountain Power, I'll talk about it a little later, but they all have plans in place and they know.
So the specific strategies that get employed for slowing the spread, we really develop them for every stakeholder, given their specific risk that they pose for exacerbating the spread of emerald ash borer. We've got the movement of wood. It applies, when we talk about the slow the spread efforts, we're really talking about the infested area, both the red and the yellow areas of the circle. If wood is cut within that area, then there's a risk that it's infested. And we've developed slow the spread recommendations to based on the product that's being cut and based on the user to slow the spread. We've broken out the recommendations into flight season, this time of year, when there is the greatest risk of spreading the bug. In non-flight seasons, there are different practices to apply. But I think it's important that folks recognize that while we do have slow the spread recommendations, if you do see that it's visibly infested, then it's illegal to move it outside of the slow the spread recommendations. So we've got these recommendations, they're best practices whenever you're in the infested area. I'll move to them right now. So on the back, on the table in the back, there are specific practices for homeowners, landowners, wood processing facilities, and it's outlined by product. So these are recommendations to apply when you're in the infested area. I think it's also wise if you are outside the infested area, and while this doesn't apply to residents of Bristol, if you have folks outside the infested area, they should be thinking about making sure that the firewood that they purchase has been handled in a way that's consistent with these practices, and otherwise they're risking importing wood. It's your responsibility to avoid exporting the pest. Other folks have the responsibility to avoid importing the pest. And it just takes a huge amount of communication in order to pull that off successfully, but it's important to minimize the risk.
So one thing that I've thought out loud is asking firewood providers to not even bring ash and firewood. I mean, maybe firewood providers here. I don't know if that's a practical thing to ask. Have you had anybody doing that, just saying, please, bring maple, bring whatever, but don't bring ash into my town?
I think certain providers are considering that option. There are, where there is kiln drying, that's possible. There are, because that will kill the bug when it reaches a certain temperature. There are mills that are saying we don't want to accept logs from the infested area. And so there are business partners who are applying the slow the spread recommendations, I do think that to the extent that communities can employ folks who are handling firewood and moving it in certain areas to adopt the slow the spread practices, I think that's just being a responsible part of the community. And to the extent that you can encourage that, I think it's great. So there are many details of the slow the spread recommendations. Again, they are recommendations, they are not the law, except where wood is visibly infested. If you are not applying the slow the spread practices, then the Agency of Agriculture does have some enforcement abilities there. We have not run into that today, that I know of.
Right.
Okay. So, for a lot of landowners, it's hard to conceive of how significantly this could impact their forest land. And if folks have seen pictures and looked at the slides that at least showed the degree of mortality is really significant, and that's got a huge number of implications. And I think a lot of folks want to know, should I cut my ash trees now? And there's a lot of folks who are recommending that. And the answer is maybe, but not necessarily. And before folks are rash with their ash, you got to understand the problem before you determine what the solution is. I think there are some really valuable questions to answer for yourself first before you jump at that, the reaction to harvest the ash. Do I have ash, and where? What will happen when my ash trees die? Will it result in a problem worth avoiding? There are many places where there are a lot of ash. As Elise mentioned, 6% across the landscape. There are some places that don't have any. There are some places that are dominated by ash. And the way that emerald ash borer is going to affect forests is going to vary greatly based on the percentage of the ash and the condition of the ash. So if you're a forest landowner and you have a forest management plan, most of those plans describe how much ash is actually in various areas in the property. Take a look at your property. You don't have a management plan. Learn what ash looks like. Find out where the ash exists. And then really understand how many ash do you have? Where are they? How big are they? And then recognizing that a huge number of these ash trees die, I think it's important to recognize what happens when they die. So they're going to die over a period of 3 to 5 years in most cases. The space that ash occupied in the canopy will become available to adjacent trees or plants on the property or in the understory. So if you have really nice sugar maple in the understory or other trees that you're excited to be growing, then if the ash trees die, then those are going to get released. And maybe that's sad to see the ash leave, but you're going to have healthy trees growing in their place. If you have buckthorn or barberry or other invasive plants in the understory, then those plants are going to get released. And that is going to carry into the future and shape your management options, both for ecological and economic objectives on your land. So in all cases, even if the tree doesn't die, the economic value of the tree will be lost quickly after initial infestation. So because these bugs are cruising through the wood, there's reduced volume. Oftentimes the hearts of the trees will explode, not literally blow up, but they expand, so the dark wood in the middle of the tree is much bigger, and the value of that log will be less. As the trees die, they become brittle, and they will shed branches, and the trees will eventually fail, and all of that not only is a problem ecologically, but it can also create a hazard for folks, depending on the proximity to targets or trails, parking lots, etc. Elise made a really important point. We can't stress enough how important it is in a place like Bristol, where we have a known infestation, that it's important to make a game plan now for forest land. It's important to know that ash trees will die and the impact will be significant. But I also want to add a dash of hope to this. While a huge amount of research has gone into looking at the rate of mortality, There's been research that suggests that 99% of ash trees die, and that's valid research. At the same time, a recent publication came out that looked at sites in Michigan in forest land and found that on sites near the epicenter, they found that among the sites, survival ranged from 0 to 99%. And on average, among many of these sites, there was about 75% of trees were surviving. And I don't know how to reconcile that research, which I think is valid, with the research that says that 99% of trees are going to die. I don't know how to do it, but I do think that it helps me recognize that holding on to ash on my forest land is a really important strategy. It's part of the big picture, and while many trees are going to die, and some of the death of some of those trees may make it appropriate for me to harvest them, to realize economic value, avoid hazards, release healthy trees beneath them. I don't want to, the scariest thing for me as a forester is to lose ash from the forest. And if I cut them prematurely, then the gig is up for ash. So I'm really thinking how to achieve management objectives, make sure my land is safe, make sure it's growing healthy trees, make sure I'm realizing some economic value, but also retaining ash in the process across the diameters that are represented on the stand.
I know the ashes that are surviving, are they not being infested? Or they're being infested and somehow it's not coming?
They are being infested, and so in that survey or that study, they were infested, and it's important to qualify that in the most recent study, it's white ash that were surviving. In the same area, studies looking at black ash and green ash were showing that 99% mortality. And so it's the white ash that lived around here more in the uplands. Green ash near the lake, black ash in our forested wetlands. We can't carry the same hope for them.
So in that study here, were there enough black and green ash to be valid statistically? Or was it?
Could you repeat the question?
The question was in the research, were there enough black and green ash to be statistically valid?
Because I know in some places it's so little.
I really don't know how to fully evaluate.
I think they had a fairly equivalent amounts.
Judy suspects that there was a reasonable studies sample size.
Are you going to cover inoculation, or that's out of time?
Yes.
I will.
We will. So, given all the realities, when the trees die or when they're injured, will I have a problem on my hands? Will I lose timber value? Will I create hazards? Will I spread, or will invasive plants spread as a result of that mortality? There are basically two options. You can do something, or you can do nothing. Is this helpful? Sorry. It's, in some of these early on, we really dove into the nuance of the management responses, which is way too much, way too fast. And so we boiled it down here. If you're doing something, there are different degrees that you can use to respond. Just basic monitoring. What's going on in my forest land? You can just say, you know what, I'm just going to let the trees die. I'm going to focus on invasive plant control. That's a reasonable strategy. You can say, you know, I'm just going to make sure that I'm safe when I'm out here in the woods, and I'm going to drop select hazard trees and let the rest do their thing. If you're looking to recoup the potential economic value, then look beyond the value of the ash. Look to the future value of the forest. And I'm not just talking about the economic value of the forest, I'm talking about the ecological values. When folks go out there to liquidate the ash resource, in some cases, maybe they're lucky and there's a whole bunch of biodiversity and other values that get retained in the process. But in some cases, management can undermine that. And it's important to be thinking about how am I going to maintain the, am I going to be growing healthy sugar maple? Am I going to be growing healthy basswood? Am I maintaining water quality in the course of my management actions? So approaching forest management thoughtfully is really important. If you choose to do nothing, Continue to pay attention to your forest. A decision today doesn't necessarily need to be the decision next year as you recognize new opportunities or new challenges. Continue to consider potential impacts and, of course, reconsider it if necessary. Whatever management you do, think of a few basic goals. Maintain ash as a component of the forest. If you want to take some, fine, but leave some. And leave them across the diameter distribution, so don't just leave the small ones, leave some big ones as well. Promote a diversity of native species. So, in some places where ash is dominant, we got to replace them with something that's native and something that's going to thrive and maintain healthy forests. Conserve the economic value of ash. I think this was a goal that we really set out when EAB was out somewhere beyond the horizon and people were really prematurely cutting. In a place like this, conserving economic value may actually mean harvesting it if you really have the goal of realizing that, the economic value. No matter what you do, slow the spread of emerald ash borer, apply the slow the spread practices, think about how you're moving that wood. And in all of this, work with a licensed forester to plan and implement your management. They'll help to make sure that they understand your objectives and can apply it on the ground. And if you're in current use, then you got to stick to your plan. You can amend it if needed. There's a policy in the table in the back that outlines how to approach that. Work with a licensed forester, and timing matters. It is possible to act too soon or too late relative to soil conditions, seed years, markets, invasive plants, logger availability, and where the infestation is. I think in a site like this, it's not, I think, with the exception of where the infestation is, you're not going to act too soon relative to the presence of EAB. And when you do conduct work, or if you do conduct work, establish a contract that ensures the implementation of the slow the spread practices. Have your forester write that into the contract so that you can be confident that the harvesting that you do on your land isn't going to exacerbate the spread of EAB.
Okay, thank you, Keith. Thank you, Judy. I'm going to talk quickly about homeowners and municipalities. So I've done a lot of talking with municipalities in the past year. We have done workshops with a lot of the regional planning commissions, transportation planners, just doing talks for tree committees and conservation commissions. And we really are encouraging towns, municipalities to plan right now, regardless of where you are in the state, but particularly in infested areas. Because of that time frame, because we know that it's going to play out over the course of the next decade in Addison County. You have time, so make a plan now, and for municipalities, this could be a very expensive pest. You have a lot of ash on your roadsides, so being able to spread that cost out over time makes, I think, a lot of sense and is very strategic. In our built environments, so in our downtowns, in our neighborhoods, in our municipal parks, in our town greens, those management options, the do something or do nothing, are a little different because you can treat your tree, which I'll talk about in a moment, and the treatment, if done correctly, is extremely effective. You can remove the tree and hopefully replace it, but the do nothing option is really not appropriate when there is a potential risk to human safety or to property damage, infrastructure damage, etc. So trees on the streets, in your neighborhoods, in your house, you really need to make a plan and be ready to make a decision about whether you're going to treat that tree or you're going to remove the tree or let the tree die before. You really don't want to wait until it dies to remove it, which I'll talk about in a minute. But just to show you a couple things, this is something that's happening in Burlington. I mentioned before, Burlington has about 1,275 street trees that are ash, and they're not intending on treating any of them at this point. What they are really focusing on is interplanting. So a lot of those trees are planted in areas that were just monoculture ash. And if you go to South Burlington, if you go to Essex Junction, I don't know anywhere in Middlebury that's monoculture, maybe that one row. landscape architects really like the idea of one uniform tree lining a street, and so a lot of these developments that were planted in the 80s and 90s, were monoculture planted with green ash. So one of these neighborhoods in Burlington has about 250 of the green ash in town, and we're doing a lot of interplanting. I live near this area, and we're using barrier trees and volunteers and putting a diversity of species in so that they're the kind of the next generation of trees will not just be one species that is susceptible to something like this happening again in the future. We should have learned our lesson after American elm, but unfortunately, in a lot of places we did. This is a demo of a systemic trunk injection, which is the method of injection of the insecticides that the state of Vermont recommends using, and I'll have a whole slide on this, but just to show some of these management options. And then this is, has anyone been in an area and seen this, like Pennsylvania, New York? Chris, have seen it?
New York.
Did you see it? Like just like the dead ash? Yeah. It's impressive if you when we see it. So this is in New Hampshire. This is a field trip that one of my colleagues went on last year, and these are all just dead ash that are right along the roads. And these towns are not doing, and they're not being proactive about it. Yeah.
What's the cost of treating a tree?
Yes, I will get there. I'll get there. Okay, before we get there though, I just want to have this conversation about what happens to the ash, the wood of these trees. As you all know, something like an elm, on my drive down here, I like for a minute and a half, I just counted the number of dead elms I saw along the roadside. I think it was like 28 in a minute or something. So we know elm, for example, can stand dead for a really long time. It doesn't seem like everybody's freaking out about all the dead elms on the side of the road and cutting them down. But the research around what happens to the ash wood when infested by EAB is pretty harrowing. It's pretty, it will really make you pay attention. So for arborists, we have a couple in the room that are practicing arborists. This is something that that field of arboriculture is really paying attention to. It's really dangerous to work in trees that have been infested with EAB. Keith mentioned that they will start shattering, so that's one thing that we're seeing, that the wood becomes really desiccated. So they'll start shedding their branches, and instead of just falling, they're shattering when hitting the ground. So that's one thing with like a cleanup crew, if you're taking trees down that have been infested with EAB, not only is it more dangerous because the wood is more brittle, but also opposed to just dropping logs on the ground and throwing them in the chipper, a lot of that is going to be cleanup, that time to clean up the project itself. We watched a webinar a couple months ago. Did anybody else watch this webinar about this new research that they've been doing so they're using basically sound waves to measure the structural integrity of the wood. They put these little sensors on the base of the trees at not infested, year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4, year 5 and dead, and looking at how solid that wood is, how much integrity does that wood have. And after 1 year of infestation, which, as you saw from Judy's slides, you may not have any idea that that tree has EAB in it. The strength of the wood has already been affected by the pests in the tree. So these are just some of the points that I pulled from that webinar, which is actually linked on our Urban Community Forestry website. So they said that once you know a tree is infested with EAB, you should be treating a 5-inch branch like it's a 1-inch branch. So the wood strength is much diminished. So you're looking at the 5-inch branch is going to break with the same amount of force as a 1-inch branch would in a healthy tree. The strength of the wood decreases after 1 year. 0 is the number of trees, dead trees, ash trees across the landscape that should be climbed. There have been a number of fatalities across the country, and a lot, if not all, of the major tree care companies, Asplin, Bartlett, Davey, these that are contracted to do a lot of the tree work in towns, and especially for utilities, they will no longer have their workers climb an ash tree if the leaves are not on, so in the dormant season, because they don't know, they can't assess how much of the canopy is live in that tree. That means that if you're having a tree removed, they're going to need to bring a crane in or a lift instead of climbing, so that makes the price go up 2 to 3 times. So this is obviously new to Vermont, but it is not new to a lot of other places, and a lot of those companies have been in the epicenter and really have been dealing with this for a long time. This last point is the one that really sunk in for me, is that the quality of wood of an ash killed by EAB can be compared to that of a styrofoam cup. So the presenter said a styrofoam cup. So if you're walking through a stand of dead ash from EAB, pretend they're all styrofoam cups. We had the utility arborist from National Grid, which is the utility, a large utility on the western side of New York State, come in to talk to all the utilities last year, scared the pants off all of them. They're working on an $8 to $9 million budget several years in a row now. This is in western New York. They said that when they're out clearing the transmission lines, which are the ones that generally run through the forest, the vibrations of their equipment through the forest is enough to topple some of these trees. So that's the situation we're talking about. These are some pictures that Mike Parisio, who was with FPR, he just left for a job in Maine, he took in his hometown in New York a couple weeks ago. And to see that these trees are snapping, like these are just ash that just snapped right at the base. Here's another one. Just middle of a stem, just snapped, just like that. So you know, when we're talking about why it's important to think about management of these trees along roads and in our public spaces, this is why. We really don't want to see a lot of dead ash trees along roads that are heavily traveled, have people living on them, walking on them, and understanding that the longer you wait to make a plan, the more impacted you're likely going to be by the immediacy of needing to do something. So for communities in Vermont, many of which are very rural in nature and don't have existing tree budgets at all, or their tree budget is a line item in public works called vegetation management, we really are encouraging planning now, and this needs to be on the radar now. I will say of every community that I know of that asked for any level of funding in the 2019 year at town meeting day, every single town got it. So whether that's a $2,000 ask or an $89,000 ask, every town got it. So this is just to say, I get a lot of pushback from conservation commissions and select board members off the bat saying, oh, nobody wants to fund this, that we're not going to be able to fund it. Just, that's a good sign right there. I think people know this is going to be an issue, it's going to be a burden on communities, so everything got funded this year. That's not to say it won't happen in the future, but I think it's a good sign. I'm not going to go too much into depth on municipal management because of time, and this is a public meeting, so talking more generally, but for homeowners, it's kind of the same thing as the forest landowners. Right now, do you have ash? Where are your ash on your property? What are the ash on your property that will have an impact on your property or people or the town right-of-way? So those are really important things to be thinking about right now. And then you assess. Do you say, I want to save these ash, I want to preserve them? I think by and large, I talk to a lot of homeowners who have an ash tree on their property that they love and they want to preserve that. Understanding that insecticide treatment is a long-term commitment. We will likely have to do it for the life of the tree. You need to think about it. I think a lot of people need to think about that. But if you think it's worth saving, think about it, because it's not necessarily going to be the more expensive option. I'll talk about that in a minute. Know where the infestation is, so sign up for that EAB listserv. Keep an eye on the health of your tree, and then when you're within that zone, when your community is within 10 to 12 miles, it's time to treat. I think one thing about treatment that is important to recognize is that you need to be treating the tree while it's photosynthesizing. So you can't treat it over the winter. So that's another consideration. We say 10 to 12 miles of the infestation, but we don't know where else it's going to pop up this year. So I know of people in Charlotte, for example, that have been treating for a couple years, that have trees that they just love that much that they don't want to see. So for towns, again, ash trees do play an important role as street trees and park trees. Municipalities need to ensure public safety, and they can be strategically proactive. There are things you can be doing now, and one of them is is getting the lay of the land, doing an inventory, understanding what your vulnerability is. I'm not going to talk about this because we don't have time, but I'm going to talk about inventory. So some of you are staying afterwards for a little intensive training on our ash inventory tool, but it doesn't have to be a really thorough process if you don't have the capacity. So we really recommend that all communities at least do a survey, and it's the same for homeowners or landowners, just understanding again, where are your ash, where are the biggest densities. For towns, we think about what are the most traveled roads, and where do those roads intersect with where your high density populations of ash may exist. We have a whole website on ash inventory options. We have sample paper forms. If you are one person and know that you can't get anyone else in your town to help you, you can use a tally sheet and just do a sample and make an estimation like Randolph did. But we last year started working with our GIS office at Agency of Natural Resources, and we use this tool called Arcgis Collector. It is an app that you download to your phone or to your iPad, and it's free, and I run trainings on the tool, and right now, in Charlotte, we have over 20 towns that have been using this within the last year, and over 12,000 trees in the system. So essentially, towns do the inventory. The legwork has to happen from the community, so whether it's students from the mountain school in Berkshire that are doing this inventory, or it's a summer intern in Charlotte, one person that's doing it, or it's a group of volunteers, 25 volunteers at Calais that are doing it. They're putting in the time. When they're finished, they let us know. We send them a spreadsheet, we send them a shapefile, so a GIS file, and then they can do with that data and information whatever they need to make a plan. Here is some budgeting info. Here's some rough estimates on costs for removals, treatments, replacement, and stump grinding. The removals is really hard, and we don't have great data right now on what it's going to cost for removals along the rural right-of-way, which I know that is an interest of many municipalities. But the Forest Service uses this $18.33 per diameter inch figure. I have called and talked to probably 15 practicing arborists across the state, and the range I've gotten for removals is anywhere between $150 and $3,500, based for an individual tree. And that's based on where the tree is located, how large it is, how much equipment's going to be needed to come in, how close it is to utility lines, all this stuff. So when I say it may not be more expensive to treat your tree, I'm being honest here, because if you have a tree that would cost $3,500 to remove, paying $12.50 a diameter inch to treat it every other year may not be more expensive in the long run. And you're maintaining that tree. You're maintaining all the benefits that a mature ash would provide on the landscape. Stump grinding is not something that I anticipate anyone would do along a rural right-of-way, but homeowners, if you're planning to treat a tree there, or to plant a tree there as a replacement tree, you'd get the stump ground. Tree plantings range, again, if you're going bare root versus if you're buying something bulb burlapped. And then the insecticide treatment. The range on that, the low end, that $3 range, that's the communities, the few communities we have right now, Rutland and Montpelier, that actually have someone on staff, city staff, get their pesticide applicators certification through the Agency of Ag, and they invested in an injection system, and they're buying the product direct. So Rutland City is treating 110 of its ash trees, and they're doing it at less than $3 a diameter inch because they have that in-house staff. If you are going to hire an arborist, we recommend hiring a certified arborist through the International Society of Arboriculture, and again, they need to have that Category 3A pesticide applicator's license. There's a fact sheet in the back with the 2 chemicals, and actually I have a poll, here we go. With the 2 chemicals that our state is recommending, there are several products that include these chemicals. So these are the base chemicals, the emamectin benzoate and the zataractin are the chemical names, but there's about, I think, maybe 5 registered products in the state that, where those are the active ingredients. These are both non-neonicotinoids, which means they are in the pollinator class of lowest impact, the pesticide class of lowest pollinator impact. So they will have an impact on insecticides. That's the job of an insecticide, is to kill insects. But as a systemic trunk injection, it's not being sprayed on the foliage, it's not being sprayed on the bark, it's not being applied in the soil as a soil drench, it's being directly applied to the trunk through kind of an IV system, if you think about. Someone said the other day, I love this, that it's kind of like a reverse sugar tap. So you're not extracting, you're pumping the insecticide into the tree, and it takes it up naturally through its natural processes. So the other thing about it is, I mentioned before, it needs to happen at least every other year. So in high population density, the different products will vary in how often they say you need to apply. The Zataractin product is an organic product, but needs to be applied more often than the emamectin benzoate products. But it's still going to happen in perpetuity. So you can expect to have to be treating these trees in the long run. So for municipalities, it's harder for me to sometimes wrap my head around. There have been some stories from the Midwest of towns that said we're going to treat 2,000 of our ash tree trees. They do it year 1, year 3, year 5, year 7. Then year 9, something happens in the budget and they can't afford to do that treatment. They can't treat all the trees, and something in those trees may not survive. So for homeowners, I think it's a really good option for preservation, and I know David Brenn's been working with some landowners to look at forestry preservation as well. So as I mentioned, there's a fact sheet in the back about this, and one of the things our program is actually planning on doing is some ground truthing around, now that EAB's been here for a year, we're going to pull together a contact list of arborists that we know of and what products they're offering with some contact, because what we really don't want happening is for someone to pay $500 for 3 box elder trees to be treated by an arborist. We really want to make sure that if you're going to go the treatment route, that you're not hiring someone who doesn't know the dosage, doesn't know the proper way to apply these chemicals. Okay, quickly in the last 5 minutes, I just want to touch on utilities. I mentioned that we have been in conversation with all the major utilities. They all know that this is an issue. Green Mountain Power has 11,000 miles of distribution line throughout the state. They, by far, have the largest coverage. This is going to be a huge issue for them. They, in the past, have a 7-year pruning, vegetation management rotation. And what this EAB is really going to be doing is, instead of having a systematic, geographical, they're going to be responding to EAB as it appears on the landscape. So they just got approved to start doing ash management in the central Vermont infested area. So since then, they haven't yet gotten their northern or their southern or their Addison County. Every time they want to get more money to do management, they have to go through the Public Service Board. They're going to have to raise rates, and there's going to be a line item called EAB management on everybody's bill for Green Mountain Power. So they are very aware of it. They have their own inventory system. They contract with utility arborists. The national companies are generally who they use. They know that they're going to be playing catch up on this into the future. That's an ash in Shelburne with a line through it. Disposal and utilization, yeah, Joe.
The towns and the utility companies are going to play chicken with each other to see who's going to.
Well, towns should not be clearing anything within 10 feet of a line anyway. So I think when I'm talking with communities about ash management, they're generally ignoring what's happening on the side of the road with the lines. Because the utilities will clear that, and road crews should not be touching those trees anyway, because of the risks involved with utility arborist work. At this point, I think some communities, like Washington Electric is a small utility. I think they're more open to working with towns, saying, hey, you did an inventory, can we see your data? GMP is such a big scale, they really can't be taking individual calls from individual communities, and right now they're focused on the central Vermont area. Just a little note on wood disposal and utilization. So what happens once the wood is on the ground? In the municipal conversations, this is a big conversation because there is a protocol of when you cut trees down in the right-of-way, you leave it for the landowner. But what happens if the landowner doesn't want that wood or doesn't do anything with the wood, and then somebody comes in the middle of the night and takes the wood and drives 60 miles down the road and sells it as firewood? These are all great questions. We don't really have time to talk about it right now, but we do really encourage towns or homeowners to think, if you are going to be taking trees down, what's the use of that wood? It's a great firewood, where you can burn it. Do you want to work with John Monks and do something with a beautiful big ash that needs to come down and make a building out of it or something like that? Just very, very briefly, 3 case studies. Montpelier has been extremely active. They are an infested town. The infestation is at the National Life Building, where our agency is located. They have had an EAB preparedness plan since 2013, and they merged that and made it into a management plan that was adopted by City Council this year. They hired a new staff member on their Parks Committee, or the Parks Department, that will be helping deal with ash. They treated 15 of the trees downtown. It's the only shade that the whole downtown Montpelier gets is provided by those green ash trees, so they will be maintaining those. And they're really active in monitoring. So it's a town that has a lot of capacity, a lot of volunteers that want to be helping with this effort. Charlotte is the first town that I know of in the state to do a preemptive rural roadside removal. So they removed, has it been done? You don't know. Mostly done. So it's about a mile of road. We have their RFP up on our website, so you can see what that looks like. I know that their tree wardens spent a lot of time talking with people about this and showing the urgency and making the case for this is a management strategy. They know they have a lot of ash on their roadsides and they don't have a lot of capacity, so cutting down healthy trees that people perceive as frivolous, as maybe not necessary, that's their decision. They're mixing their knowledge of their ash resource with their capacity to manage and their risk threshold. Their threshold for wanting to deal with that risk on the roadside. And then Rutland City, I already mentioned. There were a couple of articles that were floating around last year that Rutland City is cutting down all its ash trees, but they are treating 110 of them, including the white ash on the town green, which is a really glorious tree. So, already talked about websites. Stay informed. Not only the EAB update listserv, but our program has a newsletter called Tree Mail. We have a small grants program. This year we gave out 20 $2,000 EAB planning grants. Middlebury got one. As an example, a lot of communities use them to buy iPads so they can conduct their own inventory, or to do some replacement tree plantings, or to hire someone to write a management plan for their EAB strategy. Next year, I'm happy to announce that we just found out that we're going to be chosen, Vermont's going to be chosen to do a couple of demonstration projects with Vermont municipalities that are ready to start managing and doing some roadside removals. So we'll be selecting, I think, 3 communities through a grant process. So for those municipalities that have plans and inventories in place, that's something that I'll be putting the word out about soon. These are all of our email addresses. They're all easy because they just have the state at the end of them. And we are just about at 7:30, so just open it up to questions.
You showed one there where the tree was being treated.
Yeah.
Where is there a cutoff point? Well, 10% of that tree or the top half is dead. It's been chewing down as you should.
Yeah. What do you use? 30%? 40?
For a tree to tree?
Yeah.
Well, one way to think about it is that part of the tree that's declined, the insecticide isn't going to get there, so it's not going to get better. And so I would probably decline a tree to tree a lot sooner than that myself.
Yeah.
So
trees that have a light infestation, you might know, or might not even be showing signs yet, would obviously be good candidates, but once you're seeing decline, canopy above maybe 20, 30%.
Yeah, I mean, right now we've only been injecting trees that look healthy.
That look healthy.
So,
okay.
And as long as I'm talking, people can use injection to spread out cost.
Yeah.
You know, like if you have 10 beautiful ash trees on your yard, you can't afford to cut them all down.
Yep.
You could
Treat
treat
a couple for a
9,
couple
replace
years.
1,
Yep.
you know, and the other thing in Minnesota, I know in some parks, I don't think this might be appropriate at any place in Vermont, but they're treating 5% of the trees a year, and they're finding that they save 95% of the trees in the park, like in a forested area,
Yeah.
like a big, like Heinsberg Town Forest, for instance, you know, a place like that, and then also using trap trees, and
Right.
so there's, which I find really interesting.
That is really interesting.
So,
Yeah, this is Greg Ronaldo, works for teachers. Oh, he's teachers. David?
This has been great. We've covered a lot of things, and I just made a few notes of things I'd like to cover which we haven't.
Get the microphone.
But I think it's been really informative. I'm glad we're doing this. We've had a lot of conversation about the dead trees, and that's good. But I would just like us to pause and maybe be a little bit sad about the fact that we're losing what we're losing, which is an enormous, wonderful, valuable tree that has been a big part of Vermont forever. And so I'm sad. I'm sorry to see the ash go. And I'm a little bit disappointed in myself in that I didn't get on this sooner. I feel like we're in a place where the Emerald Ash Board is. We should have been doing some other things earlier, and I'll take responsibility for not having thought about that. But a couple of points I'd like to make. And it's really important that we know that this is a cost. This is an externalized cost of the global economy. And nobody's paying the freight, but it's having a very major impact on our landscape. And all I can say is I'm really glad that Emerald Ash Borer is an Emerald Maple Borer. These are things we need to be aware of, and especially in a rapidly changing climate. So I want to make that point, but I want to be positive because I haven't written off the ash trees. I know the green ash are taking it hard, and maybe they should be written off, I don't know. But there's some really interesting things. One of the things that wasn't mentioned is that black ash is dioecious. It's both sexes. It's male and female. Black ash is a sacred tree. In Bristol, it's a very important tree, and that's the epicenter of Western agriculture. Ash trees were used, black ash trees were used for baskets. I think we should really step up the effort to preserve to the maximum practical extent, maybe even beyond practical, black ash. In terms of white ash, I personally think there's lots of options. In our woodlot of Plank Road, we're leaving all the ash. We started to inoculate the ashes, I wish we started a couple of years ago. But they are monoecious. And so we want females, and so we're going to start looking for seeds, we're going to start identifying which ones are the females, which ones are the males. People better than I, botanists, know how to look at the differentiation between male and female flowers, but I think we need to get good at that. I'm going to mention that years ago we had seed storage capacity at the Essex Nursery. I don't know if it's still there, but who knows? Maybe we want to store seed. A couple of other things. This is kind of random, but it's just stuff that I think is really important that we realize. White ash regeneration is a favorite of white-tailed deer, so the crop that comes down, the dead trees that come down, that can be left is a good thing because it'll protect regeneration somewhat from deer. I want to say also that to congratulate the Bristol Road crew that planted a lot of the trees in the town green, and they planted a whole variety of trees. There's not that many ash trees, there are a few green ash trees. I'd make a really strong pitch to save every ash that we have in Bristol Town Green. I also would like to say that we'd be really good to get good at saving sacred groves of white ash. There is variability, as the study that Keith alluded to is showing that white ash, actually there are individuals that are resilient. And so having some groves, figuring out how it is we're going to do it, how it is we're going to inoculate. For example, we inoculated 3 trees in our woods from Trees Vermont. It was awesome. I learned a ton. But I was amazed at the size of the drills being used. Now, years ago in maple, we decided we didn't have to use some big drills. And I'm just wondering, it's a little research, maybe we could use a dramatically reduced size a bit in order to minimize the wounding. And maybe we can figure out a way to do what Rutland did, which is like $3 per deep diameter inch. This is going to make it possible to save some ash seed producing groves around the town, not just focusing on municipalities. So I'm rambling on, but I just want to say I think this is really important. You have to do better to make sure this doesn't happen again. You shouldn't write off white ash. I know we want to slow the spread. We here need to figure out what it is we're going to do to keep at least some viable component of ash in our landscape. So thank you.
Thank you, David. Thank you for your latest newsletter, which was very EDP focused. Okay, we are at 7:40. I have to go downstairs with 11 people that are being trained on our inventory tool, so if there are any other questions, maybe I'll leave them to Judy, Keith, and Chris.
How does a tree that whose phloem is disrupted survive this attack?
We'd love to know that.
Could you repeat the question?
Oh, sorry, he was asking how does a tree whose phloem is disrupted survive the attack? So what helps these, they're called lingering ash, stick around? I do know in the areas of that study that they had introduced some of the biocontrol agents. So I don't know if between that and the woodpecker, the density of the insect, the pest insect is reduced, and that allows the trees to survive, and they do seem to have some resilience, some ability to.
Well, let me, this might be hearsay from Kimberly Wallen, who's professor at UVM, told me two things that the native ash do. One is when the tree's reacting, so when the eggs are laid and they bore under the bark, the tree will essentially callus over them before they grow. So they're like basically killing the larvae. So I don't know if that's what's happening in ours, but that's one of the defense mechanisms that the trees exhibit in the native frames.
Yeah, go ahead.
What is this situation with biocontrol?
So the USDA APHIS, Animal Plant Health Inspection Service, has been in charge of regulating emerald ash borer, and they're now shifting their efforts to try to deregulate and put their resources towards biocontrol. So there are a couple of stingless wasp species that have been discovered in the original range of emerald ash borer, and those have been bred. Some are easier to breed than others, so they are encouraging states to introduce biocontrols. Both Agency of Ag and Department of Forest and Parks are working closely to try to identify sites where we can introduce these wasps. Part of the problem is we have to ask the landowners to not harvest their trees for 5 years, so there is a bit of a challenge in finding locations with cooperative landowners. So that's where we're at. Did you want to speak to that? Yeah.
Well, I'm originally from Minnesota, so I have a lot of info from Minnesota. Okay. My ex-president's partner is still there. He's currently injecting 40,000 trees.
Wow.
So that's the scale of, you know, how the Twin Cities area is treating, saving their ash trees, both in parks and city streets, and they found that the exponential growth of the insect is greatly diminished because when an adult feeds on a injected tree, the adult dies and then can't go on to reproduce and infect trees that, and he's just one company doing 40,000 trees. There's a lot of companies doing it in cities. He thinks he's 2% of the market.
Well, that's great news. That's great.
So the concern in Middlebury by the select board is what is it doing to other insects, other, you know?
It's gonna kill anything that eats an ash tree.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And then how does that affect organisms higher up?
Right, and then you also have to look at, you know, the carbon sequestration, the shade, the lower crime rates in tree areas have lower crime rates, people buy more. You know, it's like the list of benefits of trees is way bigger than just the tree. So, you know, I think there is an environmental cost to intervention, and maybe, in my opinion, it's a lot less than environmental cost.
So I have a question.
how were they originally introduced to the United States? Do I feel that?
They believe that it came in on pallet material through the St. Lawrence and into Michigan.
And then the other question is, you mentioned temperature about the growth of the adults. Could you tell more about it? Like, did it be killed? Did the larvae be killed during a really cold winter, or?
No.
Yeah, they come from northern Russia and China.
I see.
It's a good question, though.
It just makes them angry.
If it's very cold for a sustained period of time, then yes, but that has to be minus 40 degrees Fahrenheit, so it doesn't get that cold anymore for long periods of time.
Even if it did, the ones that survived would be like extra hardy.
Super
It would be super.
I have a question. Our local lumber mill, is the largest in Vermont, or Johnson.
Right.
By a lot of truckloads, logs go through this town down there. There'd be, lumber was cut, logs were cut in Starksville, for instance, and trucked down. And they were infested, and we weren't. Those bugs fly off that little log coming down. And they still take that.
Wait, so you're saying hypothetically,
Yeah, hypothetically.
if they wanted to bring infested logs from, if they're not visibly infested and they move them during the non-flight season and they process them right away, that would be acceptable.
So,
right?
family law in Starksville would be law this time of year for ash. My family, we have the 28th law in Starksville, and we've got ash tree that 50 feet in the air is 25 inches on the stump. And we have a lot.
And so I think that there are a couple of things going on here. So how do we implement slow the spread recommendations here? I don't know exactly what the infested area is. I'm guessing that Starksboro is pretty much fully encompassed by the infested area. So in which case, both the mill and that property are within the infested area, and basically we're saying the infestation likely extends, and likely you're not reinfesting uninfested areas through moving wood within the infested area. Where there would be greater concern is if the harvest from your land had wood that was going up to Burlington Electric outside of the infested area, and understanding the timing of that movement and the condition and in what condition that wood was moving would be the question to answer. If it's moving as chips, then during flight season, I believe, I need to double check the recommendation, but I believe once it's chipped, then basically it's handled as the risk is dealt with. But if it's moving as logs, then that would be moving potentially infested wood, and we would say do that outside of the flight season.
Okay, thank you.
So Chris Olson is the Addison County Forester. Some folks probably know him. He's your point person in the area, whether it relates to questions like this or considering how to best manage forest land as it relates to EAB or any other forest land related questions.
I put my business cards out on the table in the front door.
Thank you.
I don't want to impose on your time, but are you available to walk and do landowners?
Yes. Just one more question. I see that there's only a few of us here, and so I'm wondering what's the effort to educate the public on this particular problem in the state? Because I don't think a lot of people are aware of that. At least I'm not sure I'm new here, but nobody that I've talked to has mentioned anything about EAB or whatever. I don't think people know about it that much.
There have been a lot of articles and press releases put out in statewide newspapers. There's been a lot of work with BT invasives for a long time. I think that there are places where there are circles within communities that are hard to gain exposure to. And it's through places like this where you plug into listservs or plug into other forums that help to spread the word. So we've been doing work since 2008 getting the word out through a huge number of venues, but there are still people that we're missing, and so it's through conversations like this that we're just keep continuing to beat the drum and continue to start the conversations with communities, landowners, and otherwise.
If there's something that you would like to have a conversation about or try to expand that conversation, we should talk. I'm a state employee, county forester here, and I could provide you with a business card. We can talk later about it to see if you want to try to expand this sort of information in your community.
Or understanding where you would have expected to have heard something about this but didn't would be really valuable.
Could we really say that one on Burr Street that you took a picture of? We've seen it, us locals, for quite some time. It's been that emerald. Did you hear someone say that the emerald boar ash takes 3 to 5 years to kill a tree? That we would probably say we've had it for 3 to 5 years at town. The emerald boar ash.
Yes, and I think it's also fair to say we've walked the one that was in Montpelier. We walked by that same tree over and over and over again after meetings like this where we're talking about signs, symptoms, etc. And it's just hard to see until it's staring you in the face. And it's just really incredible the effort it takes to really diagnose it. And then we walk away a little ashamed that we didn't see it earlier, but it's just the reality, and that's the story that we hear over and over again from folks who are working on this issue. Thank you all so much for coming.
Thank you.